Sometimes life has a habit of sneaking up on you, pulling something out of an ordinary moment that turns everything upside down. For me, it was that evening. Damp, quiet, and seemingly unremarkable. But isn't that the magic of fate? The most insignificant things at first glance become those that make you reevaluate everything. I was sitting in the living room of our old house in Minnesota, curled up in a chair, wrapped in a warm blanket like a cocoon. The television was on in the background, but I couldn't say what I was watching. My attention was wandering somewhere far away, lost in the howl of the wind outside the window. The gusts were so strong that it seemed like the house would crack at any moment, but the storm outside couldn't compare to the one raging inside me. At that moment, the door creaked, and I heard the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch. My heart skipped a beat. Someone had come. I stood up, instinctively pulling the edge of the blanket over my shoulders, even though I knew who it was. "Lauren, are you home?" came a familiar voice, full of slight fatigue, but somehow reassuring. Ezra, my younger brother. He came inside, shaking off the raindrops. His coat was soaked through, his hair darkened under the moisture, falling on his forehead. But he still smiled, his famous, slightly mischievous smile that always made me feel a little better. "Ezra." I approached closer, trying to hide my surprise. "What are you doing here? Aren't you supposed to be with friends?" "I thought you'd be alone. Jonathan is on another business trip, right?" He looked at me as if he already knew the answer. "Yes," I replied shortly. "But I'm coping." He snorted, undressing. His jacket fell with a wet thud onto the back of the chair. His boots left traces on the floor. "Lauren, you're not coping. You're just pretending." He walked over to the sofa and plopped down with the ease of someone who had long been familiar with everything here. "That's why I'm here." His words hit something inside me, something painfully familiar. He always knew how to break through my armor. It was both a comfort and a curse. "I'm glad you came," I finally said, sitting in the chair opposite. "Do you want something to drink? Coffee? Tea? What if I say I want a beer?" His eyes sparkled with mischief. "I have wine. That's the maximum." "Wine will do," he agreed, stretching out on the sofa. "And sit down already. Stop running around like a wound-up toy." I brought 2 glasses and a bottle of red wine. Sitting back in the chair, I watched Ezra. There was something reassuring about his presence. Even after all these years, he remained my anchor, the person who could calm the chaos of my life. "How's work?" I asked to fill the silence. "Normal," he said, shrugging. "Although sometimes I feel like I'm wasting time. It all seems pointless, you know. Day after day, the same thing. Do you ever feel that way?" His question caught me off guard. I hesitated, trying to come up with something plausible, but instead honesty burst out like a cork from a bottle. "Sometimes," I replied. "Sometimes I think my life has stalled, like I'm watching it from the side but not living it." Ezra looked at me intently, his eyes darkened. "That sounds awful." "And what about you?" I hurried to change the subject, but he kept looking at me. "Me?" He leaned back on the sofa, putting his hands behind his head. "I'm not doing so great either." His words hung in the air, as if he was about to say more but stopped. Silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of rain outside the window. "Lauren," he finally spoke, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Are you happy?" This question hit me like lightning. Am I happy? My marriage to Jonathan felt more like an arrangement than something real. We lived under the same roof, shared the same bed, but there was an emptiness between us that grew deeper. But how could I admit this out loud? "I don't know," I finally managed to say, avoiding his gaze. "And you?" He was silent for a long time before answering. "I think I don't know what it's like to be happy," he said. His honesty was almost unbearable. It was not the kind of conversation we were used to having, but at that moment, something changed. I felt the walls I had built around myself beginning to crack. We talked for a long time about work, about childhood, about things we usually didn't discuss. But behind every word, there was something else, something unspoken, something that became more tangible with each passing minute. And when our eyes met across the room, I felt it. That moment when something seemingly ordinary suddenly turns into something completely different. It was the first step towards a line that I didn't even know I could cross. Time always slows down in moments that are truly important. The night continued, but it seemed like the hours had almost stopped. The light of the table lamp cast soft shadows on the walls. The rain outside tapped in a rhythm that only intensified the feeling of isolation. We sat opposite each other, like two actors in a play, ready for a denouement that neither of us could predict. Ezra took a sip of wine and leaned back on the sofa. I watched him, watched how his fingers lightly twirled the glass, how his gaze wandered around the room but always returned to me. It was a look that read more than just brotherly concern. I liked it, and it scared me. "Do you remember when we used to climb the old pear tree in Grandma's backyard?" he suddenly asked, his voice soft and thoughtful. "Every time I climbed higher, you always stood below and said I might fall." I smiled, but I felt the weight of the past crashing into the present. "Of course I remember. You were always the risk-taker, and I was the one trying to keep you safe." Ezra looked at me as if that role had changed. His gaze was piercing, studying. It was something new, something I couldn't understand, and that took my breath away. "Maybe I climbed higher because I knew you were there to catch me if I fell," he said. I wanted to respond, but I couldn't. His words caught me off guard. It was that moment when the past, present, and an uncertain future intertwined in a way that scared me. He always spoke directly, but there was something different in this, something that made me feel like the ground beneath my feet was shifting. "Why are you here, Ezra?" I finally asked, deciding to break the silence. He looked at me for a long time, as if pondering his answer. "Because I feel like you're alone," he said softly. "You look like someone who's been lost for a long time." These words hit me like a slap. Lost? I wanted to argue, but I understood that he was right. This feeling of drifting had been with me for a long time, but no one but Ezra noticed, not even Jonathan. "And what, in your opinion, should I do about it?" I asked with barely concealed irritation. Ezra shrugged, but there was a strange fire in his eyes. "Start by letting someone be close," he said. "You don't have to deal with everything alone, Lauren." His voice was so sincere that I felt something inside me shift. These words hit the very depths of my soul. I had been so busy trying to be strong, trying to pretend that everything was okay, that I didn't notice how I myself was turning into a shadow. I lowered my eyes to my glass, avoiding his gaze. My chest tightened with a multitude of emotions: anger, shame, longing, and something else that I couldn't name. "It's not that simple, Ezra," I finally said, my voice trembling. "Maybe not simple, but possible," he replied, moving closer. Now there was almost no space between us. I felt the warmth of his presence, heard every movement he made. It was wrong, I knew it. But instead of moving away, I stayed. My heart was beating faster than it should have. I reminded myself that this was my brother, someone I had known all my life. But now, looking at him, I saw not just the boy who once laughed, climbing trees. I saw a man who understood me better than anyone else. "Why are you here?" I asked again, this time softer. He reached out and touched my wrist, his fingers lingering a moment longer than necessary. It was just a touch, but it felt like it closed a circuit between us. "Because I feel like we need this," he said, his voice barely audible. "Maybe more than we're willing to admit." These words hung in the air, like smoke after a fire. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. At that moment, I knew I was at a crossroads. One path led to stopping everything right here, the other led to something that could destroy everything. "Ezra, we can't," I began, but the words stuck in my throat. I know, he interrupted, and yet I can't ignore it. His honesty was painful. It was as if it tore me apart. I wanted to run, to hide, but his gaze held me in place. It was that moment when all masks were torn off and we were left facing each other as we truly were. Lauren, I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to know that you're not alone. These words sounded almost like a promise, and there was something in them that made my heart flutter. I turned away to hide the tears that were beginning to well up. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was dangerous. But I also knew that more than anything in the world, I wanted someone to see me. Not just as a woman in a marriage, not just as an older sister, but as who I truly was. And Ezra saw. But the tension of that night became unbearable. We talked with Ezra, but each word carried more meaning than could be said aloud. Each glance became longer, each touch more tangible, and I knew that this was only the beginning. Time seemed to stop, leaving us alone in the silence of the house, filled only with the sound of rain monotonously tapping on the windows. The room was dimly lit, but bright enough for me to see every line on his face, every expression in his eyes. We were sitting closer to each other than we should have been. Between us remained only a few inches, but this distance felt like a bridge between worlds. Ezra slightly shifted forward, his knee accidentally brushed against mine. It was almost an imperceptible movement, but it pierced me like an electric shock. I quickly looked at him, but his gaze was already seeking mine. His eyes were warm and thoughtful, but there was something more in them. Tension, confusion, vulnerability. "Lauren," he began, but his voice faltered. I waited, holding my breath, not knowing what he was going to say, but feeling that it would change everything. Time stretched into eternity. I tried to focus on the sound of the rain, on my breathing, on anything to avoid thinking about him. But my whole world narrowed down to one person sitting in front of me. "Do you think I've gone crazy, right?" His voice was soft, but there was an attempt to laugh. "No," I replied, barely audible. "I think we're both confused. I didn't know where these words came from, but they were the truth. Everything I felt at that moment was a mix of contradictions: fear, guilt, longing, desire. I turned away, trying to avoid his gaze, but he wouldn't let me. "Look at me, Lauren," he said softly but insistently. I turned my head. His gaze was fixed on my face, and there was something inexplicable in it. It was more than just brotherly concern. It was more than I could understand. He reached out and gently touched my palm. His touch was warm, barely perceptible, but it was so significant that I felt my fingers tremble. I wanted to pull my hand away, but instead my fingers lingered on his. We sat like that for several moments, which seemed like hours, while neither of us dared to speak. "We can't," I began, but the words stuck in my throat. "I know," he interrupted, but did not move his hand. His fingers gently squeezed mine, as if he was afraid that I would disappear if he let go. "But that doesn't make it any less real." These words broke down the wall I was trying to build between us. They were simple, but their weight was so powerful that I felt the mask fall off me. I could no longer pretend that this didn't exist, that it was just a coincidence, that everything would return to normal. "Ezra, this is wrong," I said, but my voice was barely audible. "But it's true," he replied, his voice lower, his breath warm and steady. He leaned forward, the distance between us shrinking to a minimum. I could feel his warmth, hear his breath mingling with mine. My heart was beating so loudly that I was sure he could hear it. I knew I should have moved away, laughed, thought of something to break this moment, but I couldn't. I looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. This was my younger brother, and at the same time, he was someone completely different. Someone who made me feel alive after months, years, when I felt like a ghost. "Do you want me to stop?" he asked, his voice trembling, but there was hope in it. I knew this was the moment when everything could change. One word, one gesture, and it would all end. But instead, I slowly shook my head. His hand rose, his fingers gently tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. This gesture was so simple, but it made my heart flutter. His palm remained on my cheek, and I felt the warmth from his hand piercing me to the heart. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said softly, his eyes fixed on mine. "And it's driving me crazy." I couldn't respond. My breath was ragged, my thoughts chaotic. And then he leaned in, slowly, carefully, as if testing to see if I would stop him. His lips brushed mine barely perceptibly, as if he was afraid of breaking something fragile. This moment lasted an eternity. It was not a kiss. It was a touch, an exploration, a test of boundaries. I felt my fingers grip his arm tighter, all the tension inside me finally finding an outlet. And then something inside me broke. I responded to his kiss. It was not intentional, not thought out, but it was so right, so necessary, that I couldn't stop. His lips were warm, soft, but there was something wild in them, as if he too had been holding this back for too long. The world around us disappeared. There was only him, only this moment, only this feeling that was both liberating and destructive. When we pulled away from each other, I looked at him. In his eyes was everything: desire, guilt, confusion, hope. And at that moment, I knew that we had crossed a line beyond which there was no return. When I woke up the next morning, the world around me seemed unnaturally quiet. The rays of the dawn sun filtered through the curtains, filling the room with soft light, but inside me, everything was dull. I lay in bed, feeling the weight of the previous evening pressing down on me like a burden I couldn't shake off. Ezra left immediately after our eyes met in deafening silence. His eyes, usually so clear, were clouded with mixed emotions: guilt, confusion, and something else I couldn't define. I didn't try to stop him. All I could do was stay in place, pretending not to hear the door quietly closing behind him. Now, lying here, I felt like time had stretched into infinity. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the creak of the old floorboards under my feet, the sound of rain that had stopped, leaving only drops of water dripping from the roof. All of it reminded me that I was still here. But where was he? I reached for my phone but couldn't make myself dial his number. What could I say? What words could justify what had happened? Words wouldn't change anything, and I knew that. Instead, I closed my eyes and tried to focus on my breathing, but even that didn't help. Images of last night kept flooding my mind. Several days passed, but Ezra didn't reach out. His silence spoke louder than any words. In every moment of silence, I felt a wall growing between us, and it tore me apart from the inside. Every time the phone vibrated, I hoped to see his name on the screen, but it was anyone but him. Jonathan returned from his business trip 2 days after that evening. He opened the door, threw his suitcase at the entrance, and smiling, kissed me on the cheek. His touch was so familiar, so mechanical, that it took my breath away. I realized how much I had changed over those few days. "How did it go?" he asked, reaching for the cup of coffee I had prepared in advance. "Good," I replied, trying to sound ordinary, but even my voice sounded foreign. "You look tired. Is everything okay?" He looked at me with slight concern, but I knew that look wouldn't linger. His thoughts were already drifting to the next meeting, the next project, anything but me. "I just didn't sleep well," I replied, turning away to avoid his gaze. I felt like a ghost wandering around my own house. Everything that used to seem normal now felt foreign, wrong. Every word, every movement reminded me of what I could no longer return to being. A week later, I saw Ezra again. It was our mother's birthday, and avoiding the meeting was impossible. The family gathered in a small restaurant on the outskirts of town. I walked in, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes immediately found him. He was sitting at the far end of the table next to our cousin Nate. His gaze was directed at the menu, but I knew he had noticed me. "Lauren, dear, you're finally here," Mom joyfully exclaimed, hugging me. Her voice was warm, as always, but I found it hard to focus. I felt the air between Ezra and me becoming charged, even though we hadn't exchanged a word. I took a seat opposite him, avoiding direct eye contact. He was silent, occasionally looking up at me. I saw how he tensed, how his fingers unconsciously twisted the fork. The conversations at the table sounded like background noise. Laughter, the clinking of glasses, animated discussions, all of it blended into a single hum that seemed distant. My attention was focused only on Ezra, on how he carefully avoided my gaze. Finally, when the evening came to an end and the guests began to disperse, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until he went out to the parking lot and followed him. "Ezra, wait!" I called out. He stopped but didn't turn around. His shoulders were tense, as if he was bracing for impact. "We need to talk," I said when I finally caught up to him. "Talk? About what, Lauren?" He turned around, his voice sharp, but there was pain in it. "What more can be said?" I swallowed, feeling tears welling up in my throat. "You know what I feel. I know what you feel," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But you just disappeared, Ezra. You left me alone with this." "Left you alone?" His voice rose, but he immediately regained control. "Lauren, this is wrong. Everything that happened, it was a mistake. These words hit me harder than I expected. I knew he was right, knew that it was all true, but it didn't lessen the pain." "Then why can't I stop thinking about it?" I blurted out before I could stop myself. Ezra closed his eyes and ran a hand over his face. His tension, his confusion, all of it was written on him like an open book. "Because we've both been alone for too long," he said softly. "And that night, we found each other. But that doesn't make it right." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. The words stuck in my throat. He took a step back, as if trying to create not just physical, but also emotional distance. "I don't know what to do, Lauren," he said, his voice trembling. "But I know one thing. If we continue, we'll destroy everything." His words hung in the air like a heavy burden, and before I could respond, he turned around and walked away, leaving me standing in the rain that had just started to drizzle. I was left alone, watching him disappear. His figure blended into the night, and in my soul remained an emptiness that I couldn't fill. The silence that followed the meeting with Ezra was almost unbearable. It filled every corner of my life, stretching from the morning awakening to those long hours when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The silence between Ezra and me was painful, but the silence between Jonathan and me was even more suffocating. I could no longer pretend that everything was okay. The words I was afraid to say out loud had become an unbearable burden. One evening, I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. We were sitting at the dinner table. Jonathan was engrossed in his phone, as usual. His face, lit by the cold light of the screen, seemed foreign. My fingers gripped the cup of cooling tea tighter. "We need to talk," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. Jonathan looked up, surprised by my tone. "Of course, what's wrong?" he asked, putting his phone aside. I hesitated, searching for words. "I feel like we've lost something important." He frowned, genuinely confused. "Lauren, what are you talking about?" His voice was wary but still calm. "We're not the same as we used to be. We live in parallel worlds. I can't ignore it anymore." Words poured out of me like a stream I could no longer hold back. I talked about my loneliness, about feeling invisible. I didn't mention Ezra, but every detail I described was connected to what had happened between us. Jonathan was silent for a long time. His face became tense. He looked like he was trying to digest my words. "I didn't know you felt this way," he finally said. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" "Because I was afraid it wouldn't change anything," I honestly replied. His gaze was full of guilt, but there was something else I couldn't quite make out. Maybe it was disbelief, maybe it was resentment. I tried. I'm trying, Lauren, he said softly. I thought I was doing everything right, working to provide for us, taking care of you. But you stopped noticing me, Jonathan, I said. I don't just need your provision, I need you to be here, for us to be together, and instead I feel like we're just neighbours. He looked away, his fingers tapping on the table. His silence was deafening, but I couldn't stop. I'm not saying it's all your fault, I continued. We both let this happen, but I need to know, do you want to fix this, or will we just keep pretending everything is fine? His eyes met mine. In them was pain, confusion, and something else I found hard to decipher. I don't want to lose you, he said, his voice barely audible. But I don't know how to fix this. These words hit me harder than I expected. They were sincere, but at the same time full of helplessness. I understood that he really was trying, but he didn't know how to break through the wall that had grown between us. We both need time, I said, my voice trembling. But, Jonathan, I can't pretend everything is okay anymore. I need to figure myself out. He nodded, but in his eyes, I saw fear. Maybe he understood that time could mean the end. We ended the conversation that we had been putting off for so long, but it brought no clarity. Instead, it left a feeling of emptiness and uncertainty. Several more weeks passed. I barely saw Ezra. We didn't talk, didn't write to each other. Sometimes I thought he was deliberately avoiding me, but deep down I knew he just didn't know how to be around. I missed him, not just as the person with whom I shared that moment, but as the brother who had always been there. One evening, as I was returning home from the store, my phone vibrated. Ezra's name appeared on the screen. My fingers paused for a moment before I pressed answer. Hi, his voice was soft but familiar. Hi, I replied, trying to sound calm, though my heart was beating faster. I thought you deserved an explanation, he said after a long pause. Ezra, it's not necessary, I began, but he interrupted. No, Lauren, it is. I was a fool. I should have talked to you right away, not run away. His words were sincere, and I felt the tension in my chest ease a little. It was hard for both of us, I said, and I don't know how to deal with it. I don't know either, he admitted. But I know one thing, I don't want us to lose each other. These words made me pause. I heard in them everything he couldn't say before, his desire to preserve what was between us, and his fear of what that might mean. I don't want that either, I finally replied. At that moment, I realized I could no longer avoid the truth. We had to figure out what to do next, even if it meant admitting that there was no going back. That night became a new starting point for us. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we could move forward, even if the path was unclear. The sky above Minnesota was painted in thick shades of sunset. Deep orange, soft pink, rich purple. The road ahead of me seemed endless, like the thoughts in my head. I drove out of the city, not knowing exactly where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay within the four walls of the house that had become a prison to me. Ezra sat next to me, his silence both heavy and reassuring. We hadn't spoken to each other since that very call a few days ago, but now, being next to each other, it seemed like words were no longer needed. He had suggested meeting, and I agreed, not knowing what I wanted to say. But there was something comforting in that silent agreement, like a promise we hadn't yet realized. Do you know where we're going? He finally asked, his voice soft but penetrating. No, I honestly replied. Just somewhere. He nodded, turning his head to the window. The silhouettes of trees flashed in the headlights, and I felt his presence filling the space around me. There was something soothing about having him near, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the weight of what was happening between us. We stopped at a small roadside spot where an old wooden table stood under the cover of trees. This place was familiar to both of us. It was where we used to sit as children, discussing everything under the sun. This was our place. I turned off the engine, and the silence around became almost deafening. We sat in the car until I gathered the courage to speak. Ezra, I can't live like this anymore, I said, looking straight ahead. Everything I knew about myself, about my life, seems to have crumbled over the past few weeks. He listened silently, but I felt his gaze. I don't know what will happen next, I continued, but I know I can't keep pretending nothing happened. I tried to ignore it, us, but it won't go away. Me too, he finally said, his voice barely audible. I tried to be logical, thought everything would settle if I just left. But I was wrong. This feeling, it's gotten stronger. And I'm scared, Lauren, scared to lose you, scared to do something that will destroy everything we have. These words hit me deeper than I expected. I turned to him and our gazes met. His eyes were filled with a mix of pain, hope, and something I couldn't quite define. I'm scared, Ezra, I whispered, scared of what we did and what it might mean. He leaned closer, his voice almost a whisper. We can't change the past, Lauren, but we can choose what to do with the present. These words made me think. My life had been a series of compromises made to preserve what I thought was right. But now I was faced with a choice that didn't fit into any of my old frameworks. I could either go back or accept that the past no longer defined me. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I brushed a strand of hair from my face. I want to try, I finally said. I don't know if it will work, I don't know if it's right, but I know I want to try. Ezra paused for a moment, his face a mix of surprise and relief. Are you sure? He asked. I nodded, and it wasn't just a gesture of agreement. It was a step into the unknown, an acknowledgement that I was ready to risk everything to find myself. He took my hand in his. His touch was warm, strong, like an anchor holding me in this moment. We'll find our way, Lauren, he said. Together. We sat under the trees until late at night, talking about everything that had accumulated over years of silence. It wasn't just words about us, but about who we had become, about fears, about hopes. I realized that for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Not because everything had become easy, but because I had finally accepted myself with all my mistakes. When we got back in the car and started driving, I didn't know where the road would lead us, but I knew one thing. This journey was ours. And it was the first step toward living the way we always wanted, without fear, without lies, and perhaps that was the true freedom.